The air inside the Yamaha garage was thick, not with the smell of high-octane fuel but with a paralyzing, suffocating silence. On the monitors, the digital ghost of a motorcycle flickered across a map of the circuit. To the untrained eye, it was just a telemetry trace. But to the elite engineers huddled around the screens, it looked like a mistake, a mechanical glitch, a sensor failure. No one in the history of the sport had ever applied that much pressure to a front tire at that specific lean angle, without the front end tucking and sending both man and machine into the gravel at 160 kilometers per hour. Outside, the scream of the Yamaha V4 prototype tore through the afternoon air, a violent guttural howl that signaled a new era for the Japanese manufacturer. But inside the pit lane, all eyes were on one man who wasn't even on a bike. Marc Marquez, the 8-time world champion and the undisputed king of finding the limit, stood motionless. His helmet was off, his eyes fixed on the live feed of the corner entry at turn 1. He watched as the bike, ridden by the Turkish sensation Toprak Razgatlıoğlu, approached the braking zone. In MotoGP, there are invisible markers, lines in the sand that every rider respects. You brake here, you turn there. If you cross those lines, physics usually extracts a heavy price. But as Toprak hit the markers, he didn't slow down, he didn't transition, he defied. The rear of the Yamaha lifted off the ground, dancing in the air, while the front tire groaned under a load that seemed mathematically impossible. Marquez didn't say a word, he didn't blink. He simply shook his head slowly, a faint shadow of concern crossing his face. According to insiders, he turned to his chief mechanic and whispered a single question that would soon haunt the entire paddock. Whose lap was that? The answer would change the trajectory of the 2026 season forever. But what the paddock discovered next shocked everyone. To the outsider's DNA. To understand the earthquake Toprak Razgatlıoğlu just triggered in the MotoGP paddock, you have to understand where he came from. He is not a product of the sterile, polished Grand Prix Academy system. He didn't grow up on Moto3 or Moto2 bikes that reward smooth lines and high corner speed. Toprak is a creature of the street bike world, a champion forged in the brutal, heavy-hitting arena of world superbikes. In that world, the bikes are monsters, less refined, more prone to moving under the rider and requiring a level of physical violence to master. Toprak brought something to the table that the MotoGP elite hadn't seen in decades, the Stopie King mentality. He treats a 220 horsepower prototype like a stunt bike, using the front brake not just to slow down but to pivot the entire chassis around the front axle. For years, the skeptics in the paddock claimed his style wouldn't translate. They argued that the Michelin tires were too sensitive, that the carbon brakes were too powerful, and that the sophisticated electronics of a MotoGP bike would fight against his aggressive inputs. The narrative was set, Toprak would have to change. He would have to unlearn his DNA to survive in the world's premier class. But as the 2026 preseason tests began, it became clear that Toprak had no intention of changing for MotoGP. Instead, he was going to force MotoGP to change for him. He was riding with a level of defiance that bordered on arrogance, pushing the Yamaha V4 into territories that the factory's own test riders had labeled danger zones. Yet the real turning point happened away from the cameras, in a closed-door technical briefing that left Yamaha's senior management in a state of total disbelief. 3. Project V4 YMHA's last stand. For over 2 decades, Yamaha was the last bastion of the inline-4 engine. It was a philosophy of beauty and flow, a bike that won championships through corner speed and elegance. But by the mid-2020s, that philosophy had hit a brick wall. The European manufacturers Ducati, KTM, and Aprilia had weaponized the V4 engine configuration, leaving Yamaha trailing in a cloud of aerowake and frustration. The decision to scrap the inline-4 and build a 1000cc V4 from scratch was the biggest gamble in the company's racing history. This wasn't just a technical shift, it was a cultural revolution. Yamaha didn't just need a new engine, they needed a rider who could handle a bike that was fundamentally more aggressive, more volatile, and more demanding. Enter Toprak. The 2026 Yamaha V4 was designed with a specific magic chassis, a frame engineered to provide an unprecedented level of feedback from the front end. In the early stages of testing, the bike was a handful. It swayed under braking, it struggled with rear-wheel lift, and the electronics were constantly cutting power to save the rider from himself. But then the engineers made a breakthrough. They realized that by softening certain parameters and allowing the bike to protest under Toprak's heavy braking, they could unlock a performance window that had never existed before. The bike no longer fought the rider, it became an extension of his will. While rival teams were focusing on top speed and aerodynamic downforce, Yamaha was quietly perfecting a weapon that specialized in the art of the stop. The traction was improved, the tire spin was reduced, and the V4's raw power was finally being transferred effectively to the asphalt. However, the twist that followed would change the championship narrative entirely. For the data that lied. During the second day of the private test, the atmosphere in the Yamaha garage shifted from excitement to confusion. The telemetry sensors on Toprak's bike began feeding back numbers that didn't make sense. In the world of MotoGP, front tire pressure is a delicate balance. If it's too low, you lose stability. If it's too high, you lose grip and the tire skates. Toprak's data showed front-end loads that were 20% higher than the previous benchmark set by Fabio Quartararo. The lead data engineer actually ordered a full reset of the system. They assumed a sensor had been knocked loose or that the heat from the new V4 engine was interfering with the electronics. They swapped the sensors, they checked the GPS, they even cross-referenced the data with high-speed trackside cameras. The result was the same, the data wasn't lying. Toprak was actually staying on the brakes 5 to 10 meters longer than any other rider on the grid, including the late braking specialists at Ducati. What made the situation even more serious was the lean angle logic. Traditionally, as you increase your lean angle, you must decrease your brake pressure or the front tire will wash out. Toprak was doing the opposite. He was holding peak brake pressure deep into the apex, essentially forcing the bike to turn through sheer mechanical load. It was a high-stakes game of chicken with the laws of physics. Yamaha engineers pondered what they saw, realized it was real, and then realized something even more terrifying. They had no idea how he was staying upright. But what the paddock discovered next shocked everyone. 5. The Marquez observation. Marc Marquez has built a career on the impossible. He is the man who saved crashes on his elbows, who rode through broken bones, and who redefined what aggressive meant. But watching Toprak on the Yamaha V4 seemed to trigger something different in the Spaniard. It wasn't just professional curiosity, it was a recognition of a threat. Rumors began to circulate that Marquez had requested side-by-side footage of Toprak's entry into the most difficult sectors. In the pit lane, Marquez's body language told the story. He wasn't looking at the bike's top speed or its aero winglets. He was watching the transition phase, that split second where a rider goes from 340 kph to 80 kph. He saw a rider who wasn't just fighting his rivals, but was fighting the very expectations that had been placed on his shoulders since his first test. Marquez knows better than anyone that when a rider finds a magic feeling with a new chassis, they become untouchable. Some insiders claim that Marquez even went as far as to discuss Toprak's lines with his own crew chief, trying to decipher if the Yamaha V4 had a technical advantage or if Toprak was simply operating on a different psychological plane. The Marquez shrug, that slow shake of the head, became the most talked-about moment of the test. It was a silent admission that the hierarchy was under attack. If Marquez, the icon of MotoGP's aggressiveness, was starting to study the maneuvers of a newcomer, it meant the danger was real. Yet this was only the beginning of a far bigger storm. 6. Renegotiating physics. The maneuver itself, now being dubbed the Toprak pivot, is a three-stage act of defiance. First comes the deceleration shock, where Toprak hits the brakes with such violence that the rear tire leaves the tarmac by several inches. In this state, most riders are just trying to survive the wobble. But for Toprak, this is where the turn begins. Second is the aerial rotation. While the rear is still light, he uses his body weight to flick the bike toward the apex. Third is the front-end smash, where the rear finally touches down, and the bike is already pointed toward the exit, allowing him to get on the gas seconds before his rivals. Technically, this maneuver occurred on corner entry, an area that has been Toprak's primary weapon since his youth. But doing it on a superbike is one thing, doing it on a world-class prototype with a V4 engine and a hyperstiff chassis is another. The pressure on the Michelin front tire was so extreme that engineers feared the carcass of the tire would actually deform beyond the point of recovery. Yet the lap times were undeniable. Toprak wasn't just being flashy, he was being fast. He was shaving tenths of a second in the dead zones where other riders were simply waiting for the bike to settle. This meant the magical maneuver wasn't just a reckless stunt but a real-world performance advantage that could win races. In the paddock, whispers began to emerge that this wasn't just a new style, it was a new era of riding logic. But what happened after that left even his closest team members stunned. 7. The paddock shiver. As the sun began to set on the final day of testing, a strange tension settled over the paddock. The Toprak effect was no longer just a rumor, it was a documented reality. Engineers from rival teams were seen hovering near the Yamaha garage trying to catch a glimpse of the tire wear patterns or the brake duct configurations. There was a sense that the established order, the smooth is fast mantra that had dominated MotoGP for a decade, was being torn apart. Inside the Yamaha garage, however, the mood was more complex. While Toprak was setting the world on fire, the other Yamaha riders were struggling. The new V4, while perfect for Toprak's stop-and-go violence, seemed to be rejecting anyone who tried to ride it traditionally. This created a political rift. Was Yamaha building a bike for a champion, or were they building a bike for only one man? This is the Marquez trap that Honda fell into years ago, building a machine so extreme that only one rider can tame it. Some mechanics claimed something felt off, fearing that if Toprak got injured or lost his feel, the entire project would collapse. The pressure was building fast, and the weight of an entire factory's future was now resting squarely on the shoulders of a rider who had yet to even start a full MotoGP race. But the twist that followed would change the championship narrative entirely. The 2026 season stands on the edge of a precipice. We are no longer asking if Toprak Razgatlioglu can be fast. We are asking how the rest of the world will react when he pulls this maneuver in the middle of a 22-rider pack. In a test session, you have the luxury of space. In a race, you have the dirty air, the heat from other engines, and the psychological warfare of wheel-to-wheel combat. Some insiders believe that Toprak's style will lead to a string of penalties as rivals complain about his unpredictable braking markers. Others believe he will force a total redesign of the Michelin front tire. But one thing is certain, the limit has been moved. The Yamaha V4 project, once seen as a desperate last gasp for a dying giant, has suddenly become the most feared project on the grid. Toprak isn't just riding a bike, he is rewriting the manual on how to win. He is a reminder that in a world of data, sensors, and AI-driven aerodynamics, the most powerful component is still the human spirit, the willingness to hit the impossible zone and stay there. As the lights go out for the first race of 2026, the question won't be who has the most horsepower. The question will be, who has the courage to follow Toprak into the abyss of the braking zone. The era of defiance has